Today on the BetaFiles, music's big expression piece, the album. What happened to it? Where did it go? How did it die? Hang on to your diapers, babies. I'm the barber. This is the BetaFiles. All right, so today we're going to do kind of an observational history, much like we did with the Hate Machine episode on cable news. Before we go any further, I want to kind of point out a scheduling change. So we've moved the Optic Poet from Tuesdays to Mondays, and then starting the week of July 13th, text messages from the living room will be on Tuesdays, and then the BetaFiles on Wednesdays. Now see this here, now then on Thursday, and the BetaFiles on Friday. So we're going to be doing that schedule from here on out. We're also going to be doing, we've already uploaded a bunch of different smaller clips of the different shows. We're going to start doing that pretty regularly. So if you enjoy the long form, you can keep listening to the podcast or going on YouTube and watching the full version. Or if you just want little 15 to 20 minute snippets, you can also do that from here on out, because we'll be posting different pieces of the podcast to YouTube. Now the clips themselves will only be on YouTube. That's the one thing that won't show up on the blog. So, but everything else is still where you can get it. It's still going to be there. And also starting the week of July 13th, keep having to look at the calendar, is when we're going to have audio versions of text messages from the living room. So you'll see those start showing up on the podcast list. Okay. And we're going to roll those out one at a time. So starting sometime over the next week, you'll start to see on the podcast sites text messages from the living room just kind of start showing up in the feeds as I go back and capture the audio of those early episodes and then get caught up to where they're going. So again, the schedule's changing just a slight bit, not big. Optic Poet's going to be running on Mondays from now on. Text messages from the living room will be running on Tuesdays from now on. Wednesdays is the BetaFiles podcast, and then Thursdays, Now See This Here, Now Then, and Fridays, the second BetaFiles podcast. So every day of the week except for Saturday and Sunday. So there's that. We're also taking a slight break from Now See This Here, Now Then, so there won't be an episode the week of the 6th, but we will be back next week with new episodes for Richard Cranium. All right. Now I got that out of the way. Let's talk about the album. What is it? As an Xer, and as many of the people from my generation can attest, we grew up with our parents' record collections. And when we talk about record collections, it's not like what my sons grew up with. My sons grew up with CD towers. When my sons were smaller, I had a huge CD tower that was just chock full of CDs, and then one of those really cheap, and if you're my age, you know what I'm talking about, one of those really cheap CD style bookcases that you could get from like Walmart or Target or some place like that, some general retail store for like $25-$30. And they were just basically these like miniature bookcases that were designed for CD storage, and then of course later DVD storage when DVDs came out. But I had those. I had one of the Case Logic 120 disc albums. I had several of the Case Logic 24 disc albums. I still, even though I don't have a CD player in my car, my 12 disc wallet is still in my car. So I had my sons saw CDs. That's the point that I'm trying to make. All of my CDs now are in two pretty substantial boxes in my closet, and then my cassettes are all in one small box because the cassettes didn't. The cassettes didn't survive the way the CDs did, and I think it was about. It was probably about 10 years ago, around 2009, 2010, somewhere in there, where I digitized, where I basically ripped all the CDs that I had and got them into a folder. And it started out as a folder in iTunes, and then I transferred that to Amazon later. And it's still, even though Amazon won't let you rip and upload anymore, they're still storing all of that music that I'd ripped. Plus, as I dated different young ladies over the past decade, I would weasel my way into their CD collections and rip their CDs. So the digital library that I have is a pretty substantial one. And I think most of the people from my generation, especially, who got in on the Rip Mix Burn campaign that Apple had, probably have similar tales about building these massive digital libraries of these old CDs that they had. Because once the CD burner came out, you had the opportunity to just go to town and start ripping everything. And we already had, my first wife and I already had a pretty substantial digital library from the peer-to-peer days, where we were using things like Napster and Kazaa. But then we added to that by ripping the CDs and getting a lot of those CDs into our digital library. So it's a fairly substantial library that I have now. But like I said, my sons grew up with me having just CDs everywhere. You always had a CD, and we had the family CD player, which my son, my youngest son, who is 17 now, I gave him my old 5-disc CD player. We're not talking about the car stereo. We're talking about an actual Sony CD player for a home entertainment system, and that was the quote-unquote family CD player that we had when he was growing up. And so he got that, and that thing was about 20 years old, and he just let me know about a month or two ago that it finally died. It finally gave up the ghost, so he's searching for a new 5-disc changer. And they're still out there. They're a lot more expensive than they were, I'll tell you that. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, they were actually much cheaper than they are today. But I guess that kind of goes with the territory, right? Because the record players, back when I was growing up, record players were cheap compared to today. Record players today, I was looking on Amazon the other day, and I couldn't believe how much they wanted for a record player. So anyway, they grew up with, again, and I know I'm getting sidetracked, but they grew up with my CDs everywhere. And of course, the CDs were just albums. They were the full-length albums. Similar to the way that myself and, like I said, many of the kids from my generation grew up, where our parents had these massive stacks of LPs, the vinyls. And we grew up listening to those when our parents would get them out and put them on the record player. I remember one of the most exciting days of my life was, I think it was I can't remember if it was my 7th or 8th birthday. I got my first honest to goodness record player. They had back in the early 80s, they had these little, I guess, you could call them the Fisher Price record players, but these things were like practically indestructible. I mean, but they were designed for kids, and you could play 45s on them. And I'm going to talk about all the terminology here in a minute. But the 45s are the singles, and you could play 45s on these little heavy-duty plastic record players that were made for kids. They were made for abuse. And so I had one of those, but then I got a honest to goodness, I think my uncle bought it for me, and I got a real honest record player, and it was, I babied that thing so much. And I ended up selling it years later, when I was in my 20s, I think is when I got rid of it. And I regret getting rid of it. But I know at the time I couldn't, before I got rid of it, I couldn't find a needle for it. And of course, the problem is you got to get needles. And right at that moment when I finally got rid of it, it was a hard thing to find a needle for that particular model. But we grew up listening to those things, and in my generation, and at least my sons, just based on what I've seen with my sons and how they grew up listening to the albums that I grew up to, or that I was listening to when they were growing up, they've come to appreciate the album too. And that's not to say that we don't appreciate the album anymore. I think what has happened, and I'm going to get to this at the end when I kind of wrap things up, but I think what has happened is we have, because of the internet, because of streaming services, because of the MP3, we've reverted back to singles dominating the musical landscape. And so we've kind of lost patience with the long form album. The other day, my wife and my daughter and I were driving around. We went to the pool at her mom's house, and we drove from the pool back to Greensboro. And in between, we stopped and got some froyo. So we allowed ourselves enough time that I wanted to listen to The Black Parade by My Chemical Romance. And it was really nice to actually listen. And we listened to the entire album. We actually got home shortly after the last song went off on The Black Parade. And so it was really cool to be able to listen to the entire album in one sitting, and hear how the producer and the band and the main songwriters of the group put all this together, and put it and released it as a long form piece of art. Excuse me. So let's talk about terminology real quick before I go any further, for those of you who are not familiar with the terminology. Because you'll hear people, especially people from my generation and the boomers, talk about records. And when we talk about records, it depends on the context as to what we're actually talking about. Because typically when you hear one of us say that's a great record, we're talking about the single entity. Okay, so if you're talking about an album, say like Jay and I were talking about London Calling in the most recent Optic Poet, and we both agreed that was a great record. I think we both said that's such a great record. We're talking about the album itself, right? But the music industry labels the single as the record, and then the long play or the LP as the album. But slang dictates they're both records, right? So you hear that term, it kind of gets kind of confusing, but if you just pay attention to the context, you can tell what we're actually talking about. We're talking about the album, or we're talking about the single. And typically, if we're talking about a song, we'll say it's a great song. We won't say that's a great record, right? And when we're talking about the album, we'll say it's a great record. Because growing up, it was mostly LPs that we were in contact with. By then, the 45s by the 80s, by the late 70s, early 80s, the 45 was not as prominent as the LP. And that's the other thing, understanding what we mean when we talk about the 45 versus an LP. An LP is technically called a 72, and then the 45 is the single. All right, and when we talk about it's a B-side to that single, we're talking about the 45. On the flip side, you had two sides. You had the A side, which was the actual single, and you flip it over. You had the B side, which was just an accompanying track. Usually it was something that they kind of threw away, that they kind of just didn't think it fit with the album, or it was a live version of a popular song that they had, or it was a live version of the single, right? So different possibilities of what they would do with those B-sides. When the CD single came along, they started to expand a little bit. You didn't just get one extra song. Like in the case of the Jeremy single, you had the album cut, you had the single cut, which is what they played on the radio, or the radio edit, which was Brandon O'Brien's mix. And then you had Footsteps, which was taken from a radio show that Eddie and Stone Gossard had done, which is actually a Mother Love Bone song, but they had just stripped everything but the guitar part, and then Eddie added new lyrics to it. And then Yellow Ledbetter was the last one. So you had 4 songs on this one single. And then what they would do is that they would release different versions of the single. And I'm trying to remember, there was one band that had either 3 or 4 singles. It may have been Pearl Jam, where they had taken a live concert and chopped it up into like 3 or 4 pieces. And so you had the single that the single that the single was promoting, and then you had like 3 or 4 songs from that concert, and they spread it out over several different versions of that same single. So you had to collect them, and I think it was actually Pearl Jam that did that, and I'm sure they weren't the only ones, but they're the only that I'm thinking that was who did it, and they always had fun with that kind of stuff. So the reason why they call the single the 45 is because the RPM speed on a record player. You have, on a typical record player, you had multiple speeds, RPM speeds, so you could speed up or slow down the spinning of the record. Okay, the LP is known as 72 because it was 72 revolutions per minute, so it spun at 72. All right, the 45 spun at 45 revolutions per minute because it was so small, and you're at the middle of the motor, I guess you would say, of the table, the turntable. So that's where those terms come from. So when we talk about singles, we usually say 45s, especially when we're talking about the older stuff, like in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. You had the 45s, the smaller discs. And the thing about the 45s was the hole was this big around. Okay, I mean it was a big hole, and so you got these little plastic clips. And you would put the plastic clip in the middle of what 45 you want to listen to, and it would fit over the peg on the turntable. Some turntables had a little thing where the shaft was, the peg, that you could pull up and twist, and it would lock in place, and you didn't have to have the little plastic thing for the single, for the 45. So, but it was interchangeable for, the different types of record players that you were listening to the 45s on. And then of course the 72 is the LP, and the LP just stands for long play. The EPs typically, they were larger than the 45s, but they didn't have as many songs as the 72s. And the EP stands for extended play, and it's typically 5 or 6 songs. It's not meant to be a full album. And several different bands, like the one EP that stuck out the most for me growing up was Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies. I think there's 5 songs on that record. And it's phenomenal. but it's not a full statement. It's not a full album. It was just a bunch of songs that they, I don't know if they didn't feel worked with any of their albums they put out. They'd put out Dirt and Facelift by that point. So I don't think, I think it was songs that just didn't fit with those, and so they put them all together. They all had this dark, soothing tenor to them, or tone, and so that's what an EP is. So there's your terminology. I hope I didn't confuse you. So what happened? Well, what's the history of the album first? Well, when Thomas Edison invents the phonograph, all you have are the larger discs, which will become known as the 72s later on. 45s don't come along until a little bit after that. And the idea was the original idea was to get like an orchestra, or when the jazz bands came into play, get a concert of the jazz band on record. And so it enabled them to capture a good chunk of music, so that you could listen to this long form music on an afternoon, and you could just get caught away with the music as much as you wanted. But by the 30s, what you start to see is the single, and this has a lot to do with people like Bing Crosby and Louis Armstrong, where they're starting to write pop ballads and pop numbers that can stand apart from the albums, from the long form concert albums that have been the mainstay since Edison's invention of the phonograph. And what you see with that is a shift from this long form play to the single, and the single starts to dominate. And through the 30s and 40s, especially in the 40s, the single becomes much more popular because, number one, it's more compact. A 45 is only about this big. It's small, okay, compared to an LP. But they're more compact. They're cheaper to make. They're easier to make. The record players, if you just have a record player that'll play a 45, it's much smaller. It's easier to tote around. You can listen to a 45. You probably seen them. They look like the little typewriter things. They're about this big, maybe like a bowling ball bag. Okay, that size, right? And it's got a little latch lid to it. You undo the latches, and there's a tiny little record player there. Those were designed for 45s. For singles, so you can just keep putting 45s on them. And so that tradition kind of continues into the 50s, when we see the birth of rock, right? The early rock and roll. And of course, the early rock and roll, what is it? It's just singles. And the album itself during that period is nothing more than a way to kind of capture different singles that the artist is putting out, and then what they would do is just add covers to the rest of the album, because they didn't really pay much. They didn't really invest that much in albums, because albums were too expensive for the common person. This is more for the upper class, right? Whereas the single, the 45, is cheap, and anybody and everybody can afford it. And what's interesting is that the record industry, the history of the record industry, kind of parallels the industry of print. Excuse me. Well, novels. We'll talk about novels. In that, at first, the first true success that novels see is serialization. So they'll write a chapter a week, or every 2 weeks, or every 3 weeks, or every month. I mean, that's how Dickens became famous, is because he's writing a chapter. He's writing constantly. He's writing a chapter for these periodicals. And what they would do is they would collect the periodicals, and then take all the different chapters that had been serialized and take it to a binder, and the binder would put it together for them. It was much cheaper than actually buying the novel, the completed novel. And so you see kind of the same thing with music. They're buying all the different singles that happen to buy the full album. And rock and roll, in its early stages, really feeds off of that, really makes a mint, I guess you could say, off the 45, off the single, because teenagers can buy the single. They can afford the single. They can't afford the albums. They can afford the singles. That is until the Beatles show up. Now, if you listen to the first couple of Beatles records, it follows the standard model that had been set during the 50s with those early rock albums. You had a handful of singles that promoted the album. Basically, the singles were promoting the album. And then the rest of the album was just covers, right? Actually, I'm sorry. The albums were promoting the singles. It's flipped. It's not until later that the singles begin promoting the albums. So the albums are promoting the singles. And the rest of the album is just covers. The problem with the Beatles were they were so good that the covers were just as good as the singles. And so people started buying the albums more than they were buying the 45s. The sales for the Beatles complete albums kept going up. And we're starting to get close to the sales volume of the 45s. You fast forward you get into Rubber Soul, and this is where they start really taking the album serious, and you see Lennon and McCartney start to understand the value of that long form expression. And, well, you can start to see it with Beatles for Sale, but Rubber Soul especially. And between the fact that they were struggling with live performances, they were getting to the point where they just couldn't stand to be on the road because they couldn't hear themselves. It was chaos. It was constant mayhem. It was just a big blur. And the fact that they wanted to expand a little bit on this art form, on this idea of having this long form extended message. They come off the road, and with the success of Rubber Soul, they realize they could actually focus on just doing an album. And so they do, and the next one that comes along is Revolver. And in many circles, a lot of people consider that to be the greatest album of all time, not Sgt. Pepper's. And there's always going to be the argument over which one is it, Revolver or Sgt. Pepper's. But Revolver is the first time where they're not on the road. They don't have the pressure of a demanding road schedule. They don't have the chaos of the concerts to deal with. They can just sit down in the studio and really work something out. And Revolver is that first piece in that puzzle. And so they take what they learned with Rubber Soul, apply it to Revolver, and basically between those two albums, the birth of the modern album happens. And you get these long form artistic statements. And of course they do the double album with the White Album. They give birth to the concept record with Sgt. Pepper's. They just, everything they did was just, let's try this and see what happens. And it's genius, right? It's just amazing. In my opinion, the only hiccup in the entire thing is the Magical Mystery Tour. So anyway, God help us. So by the end of the 60s, there are other bands, and you know these bands. The Who had written Quadrophenia, and then of course they're going to write Tommy later. or excuse me, Tommy, and then they're going to write Quadrophenia later. Pink Floyd is starting to get their stuff together. They're starting to really experiment. And of course, Page and Plant get together, and you see the birth of Led Zeppelin. On top of that, you've got Clapton, who with Cream does just some amazing stuff, and then of course he gets together with Dwayne Allman. You have Derek and the Dominoes, and then of course he does this if you've never heard it, you need to go and listen to this concert, but does this amazing show with Steve Winwood, and it's mind-blowing. You've got Harrison. After he leaves the Beatles, he does some really cool stuff. Lennon starts to experiment. McCartney, of course, forms Wings, and you have some really great records that come out of that. And so you see in the 70s basically the fruit of what Lennon and McCartney had started in the mid-60s, 65, 66. And of course 67 with Sgt. Pepper's. And the industry kind of shifts gears from the single to the album and pushing the album. And that's where we see that shift from the single, from where the album is promoting the single to the single promoting the album, right? That transition. And the 45 starts to lose a little bit of favor. Especially by the time you get to the 80s, the 45 is not as prominent. It's still there, but it's not as prominent as it once was in the 50s, in the early 60s. And so what you end up with in the 70s is the problem of prog rock, right? Where they take the idea of the concept album to the outer limits and just, ruin the idea of the concept album for years. It's not until we get back to the late 80s, early 90s that we start to see the concept album, a different take on the concept album. And how to actually do it. And then, of course, you get to the 2000s and you have Radiohead's Kid A, and then eventually Green Day's American Idiot. And those aren't the only concept albums, but those are the most notables from that experimentation with the concept album in the late 80s and early 90s. But the album becomes I'm sorry I keep kicking that. But the problem, or the thing with the album, is it becomes the central tenet of the record industry, right? And the single loses favor. And you see, and believe it or not, it's the peak, and this kind of shocked me. I'm going to show you a chart here in a minute from the RIAA, which is the official, I guess you'd say, the official keepers of the music industry, and what they and how the music industry sells and all that good stuff. The official numbers, they're the ones that certify everything gold, platinum, and all that stuff. But I'm going to show you a chart, and the peak of the album actually happens in 1999 and 2000. And what we have seen over the past 20 years is a rapid decline in the album. And I'll show you in 2019. I'm looking at it right now, and I'll pull it up here in a minute because I want to talk about YouTube, and then I'll show you. But paid subscription services has become the main avenue from which people are getting their music now. And it's hard to figure out who's asking for albums and who's asking for singles. But the majority of people, and I know because my wife and I do it, we have Amazon Music, and we're asking for singles most of the time. Play this song, play that song, So it's rare that even myself, who grew up listening to long play albums and enjoying listening to long play albums, even now I'm asking for singles. It's rare that I sit down and listen to an album anymore, and that to me is kind of sad. I think it's a product of, again, this culture, and I'm going to talk about that too. And then in the 80s, we start to see something interesting happen with MTV. And it starts out as MTV is basically MTV represents two things, okay? It's a harbinger of one-hit wonders, people who are able to put out, one or two singles that are fantastic, and then the album is not strong enough to sustain them for a sophomore effort. And then the other side of that, you have MTV representing this ability to link these larger albums and play with different tropes that they create for each album. And several artists did this, but the one that sticks out in my mind is George Michael, and that's only because I'm a huge fan of George. But when you look at Freedom 90, what he does in that video is he just kind of tears down all those different tropes from all the earlier videos, and you know what he's doing. You understand what he's doing. He's cutting ties with it. And of course, the most famous piece is where the radio from Faith blows up, and of course the jacket from Faith burns up in the closet. And there's other imagery from Father Figure, and I'm trying to think of the really controversial one that Jay and I were talking about the other day. Has completely slipped my mind. But even there's imagery from those two videos that just kind of gets pushed to the side and wiped out as well. So it's a really great video. And the thing is, George's not even in the video. It's all the top supermodels of the day. They're actually in it. Cindy's in it too. Anyway, what was I talking about? So MTV allows that for these bands to build themes, not just for the one album, but then they can start connecting the dots with other albums. And Weezer plays with this a lot, right? Or did back in the 90s. But you have different, those two are the different ways that MTV is used. But the product, what ends up happening is that inadvertently MTV kind of pushes the single back to the forefront. And like Jay and I were mentioning in our thing for this week, we listened to the radio a lot, and we would try and capture the singles because when we were kids, we couldn't afford the albums all the time. And when you did get an album, right, you hoped that all of the album was good. And I mentioned Songs from the Big Chair by Tears for Fears that had a huge impact on me because that album was good for me. It was good all the way through. And so it was a good investment. And then same thing with Thriller. When I was a kid, and I'm not the only kid in America, there were millions of us. Somebody was buying that album. But there were millions of us that could listen to that album from beginning to end. But then you look at Nevermind, and that's the same thing. You could sit down and listen to Nevermind from beginning to end. You could listen to Appetite for Destruction from beginning to end. You could listen to, oh gosh, there's so many, right? Hysteria from beginning to end. You could listen to Eric Clapton's Unplugged from beginning to end. 10,000 Maniacs Unplugged from beginning to end. I love that record. Toad the Wet Sprockets, Fear, or Pale, or Coil. You listen to all their stuff from beginning to end because it was all just so good. And they're out, and you knew that their albums was going to be good. And, I talked about how I was a Pearl Jam fan. I knew the Pearl Jam records were going to be awesome, and they were. They didn't disappoint until about the last 10 years when it's time to hang it up, boys. Anyway, so what happened? Well, the 90s is the last gasp of the album, right? Because what you see with the alternative movement, that alternative push, the indie rock push, is a dedication to the art form in in the form of the Beatles, and then of course the singer-songwriters of the 70s, and the regular, not the prog rock guys, but the rock bands like Floyd, and well, Floyd's kind of a prog rock. Floyd is a really interesting band, but bands like Zeppelin, Aerosmith, the guys that took the album serious, right, in the 70s, didn't take it over serious like the prog rock guys did. And you start to see that dedication again in the 90s. Because I think in the 80s what you have is, because it was such a wasteland of one-hit wonders, these guys, they're grabbing these kids and they're throwing them up on stage with 1 or 2 hit singles, and nobody's paying attention to the fact that the rest of the album sucks, right? It's just awful. I think about... I'm trying to think of off the top of my head, like someone like Gerardo, right? Or Adam Ant. Or Flock of Seagulls, right? We have that stupid single and that stupid video, but the rest of that album sucked. It was just bad. Whereas the really good albums have stood the test of time, like the London Callings, like Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen, like Purple Rain, right? And like Thriller. I mean, Thriller's problematic, I know. I get it. It's problematic here. We won't go into the politics of Michael Jackson right now. But in the 90s, we see this the last movement of bands large scale, or acts large scale, because you also had solo artists who were taking it serious too, like Liz Phair, Madonna with Frozen, Alanis, Sarah McLachlan, right? Melissa Etheridge, we talked about Melissa Etheridge the other day. Seal, he was putting out some great records back then. And George, but I think by the mid-90s, George kind of lost step. I think the public scrutiny had really started to get to him by the mid-90s, and you can see the deterioration of his work by the mid-90s. And Elton too, and then Phil Collins by the late 90s, you start to see the same thing, the artistic deterioration. These massive solo artists that had, when they were on, but you get to the mid to late 90s, and not just because of the seismic shift that the independent movement kind of introduces through 90s rock, but you also have just simple artistic deterioration, right? And it's kind of like going back to what I just mentioned a minute ago. Actually, Pearl Jam should have broke up in 2000. I mean, there's no... Why are we still going, fellas? I love you to death, but oh my God. Don't tell Eddie I said that. Actually, please do. Please tell Eddie I said that, because it's time to hang it up. It's the same thing for you, Billy Joe. And John Bon Jovi. Oh my God, dude. Really? And Steven Tyler. What? Not everybody's the Rolling Stones. And even the Rolling Stones are not the Rolling Stones anymore. Anyway, I keep getting distracted. Sorry. So let's talk about... so the end of it. The end of it comes in the... you start to see the slide. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute when I pull this chart up. Because, again, I'm getting to YouTube here in a second. But you see the initial slide in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, right? You see the bump go down. And the reason for that is because of, at that point, by the mid 2000s, by 03, 04, 05, the peer-to-peer network had exploded. iTunes had come on the scene. And real music had come on the scene. And what we're seeing is this idea of just get the single. And we're starting to see the deterioration of the desire for an album, which in turn, the artists start reverting back to what we had seen in the one-hit wonder heavy 80s, and then of course back in the 50s and early 60s, where the focus is not on the longer form project, the focus is on the shorter form. So we start to see the singles with the singles and the EPs, right? The shorter form stuff, the stuff that is easier to manage, I guess you would say. You also start to see a shift in the technology that we're using to listen to it. We get the iPod. Now, start off with the record player, and it's about this big. It's about, maybe 16, 18 inches wide by 18 inches deep. Okay? Big square. You go from that to a cassette player. When I was growing up, I had a Walkman, like a cassette Walkman. And it fit in the palm of your hand. You just slap the cassette in. And then, of course, CD Walkman comes out. It's just a little bit bigger. It's about, maybe 5 by 6 or 6 by 6 inches. About about 3/4 the size of a regular 8-inch tablet now. So it's about that size. It's just big enough to hold a disc with a control panel on the front. Unless you got one of the fancy ones where the control panel was on the lid. I had one of those too later. But you had those. And then you get the iPod. And the iPod is smaller or the original iPods are smaller than your typical smartphone, right? And Steve Jobs is saying you could put 1,000 songs on this thing. Really? Huh. Whereas my album, which is, this big around, can only hold at most 24. And that's if they're creative, right? And the songs are really short. That's a punk album, right? I remember the first time I bought, or the first copy of Rancid's, was it Out with the Wolves? How many songs were on that? Well, even with Dookie, when you look at Green Day's Dookie, there's a lot of songs in there, and I think the whole album is maybe just under 45 minutes. It's very short, but there's songs are just popping. But anyway, and so you give us that, and we naturally move away from the album, because now we can, and one of the things that iTunes really pushed, they said, rip, mix, burn. That was the original iTunes thing, right? Rip, mix, and burn. So rip the music from your CD, mix it up, make it your own, and then burn it. And this appealed to my generation, because my generation, especially in the 80s and 90s, we were making mixtapes like crazy. And now you're giving us the ultimate mixtape. We can make any playlist we want, any way we want. We don't have to worry about digging through 12, 15, 16 CDs or tapes or both, or sitting in front of the radio trying to catch just the right moment to get that one song. We don't have to do that anymore. We can just go on our computer and mix it up. Oh my God, this is amazing. And so we naturally walked away from the album as a generation. And then, of course, our children are walking away from it too, because they haven't grown up with, and like I said, my sons grew up with those CD towers and seeing all those physical CDs and seeing me listening to them. They also saw me reverting to this new technology as well, and the evolution of that. And now they're doing it too. My children were on Spotify before I was. And now the only reason why I'm on Spotify is I'm waiting for Joe Rogan. So, waiting for that to happen, which I think is the 1st of September. Which brings us to YouTube. So all that happened, and we get into the 2010s, and there is a huge collapse in the album market. And I'll show you here in just a minute. I promise you I'm going to show you the numbers here in just a second, show you the graph. But one of the guys that I follow on YouTube, his name is Rick Beato, and he's awesome. He's totally cool. But one of the things that he does every couple months, he does a video where he's just going off on YouTube because they have slapped him with some kind of copyright, and he gets so frustrated over the copyright claim because he's got it set up to where the artist or the publishing company that they're popping him for is getting the money from the video. So he gets so frustrated and so angry. And his argument is always that, if you keep doing this, the younger generations are not going to be able to listen to the music. They're not going to be able to experience and love the music. And he's got a solid point about this. And I highly suggest you go look for these videos. His name is Rick Beato, 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 Rick Beato. He's a former producer in Atlanta. He's got his own studio down there, and he does all kinds of different things. His biggest thing is he does music education, so he does lessons. But he also does these fun little things, like there's a series called What Makes This Song Great, where he goes through and just basically track by track breaks down some of the biggest rock songs of all time. The ones that he can get away with without getting slapped for copyright. And which is interesting because he's able to break down the songs. And again, he tells you up front, I'm not making a dime off this, that all the money coming in is going out to the artist or the publishing company that's representing that artist. But he's always fussing about it. But one of the things that I realized that I'm sure that he has too, but I don't think he's expressed it yet. The record, and in no way do I want you to think that I'm supporting or standing up for the record companies, because the major labels are the very epitome of evil. However, since the mid-2000s, they have literally been caught off guard. And actually since the late 90s, they did not see the digital revolution coming. They thought the CD was it. And that's where they put their investment in that, and their marketing strategy was invested in the CDs. Their whole game was built on the CD, the album CD, the long form CD, okay? And so when the peer-to-peer networks popped up and the desire for being able to mix the singles at will, and then iTunes comes along and offers you the opportunity, okay, you can get the singles legally for $1. Well, you're going to do that. And of course, iTunes is promoting this rip, mix, burn idea. Rip it from the CDs, mix it all up, and then burn it back. And you can have all kinds of mixed CDs now, or mixtapes, as we used to call them. Well, of course, they went into panic mode, and they started putting in all these different legal options that they could put in to try and control the hemorrhaging, because it's between the mid-2000s to the late 2000s we see the collapse of the record store, and all these Tower Records, Sam Goody's, Peaches, Camelot Music, Tower, well, I've already talked about Tower Records, but all these different major record stores just disappeared. They shut down because nobody was buying the CDs anymore. We were starting to get all digital content. So you fast forward to the YouTube thing, and they're able to lock in on YouTube, and with the YouTube rights and the copyright, the way that they can manage copyrights on YouTube, it has become very hard to use music on YouTube that has been copyrighted, even if you're using the Fair Use Act, where you're using only a clip. like a very short clip that you can do in other media. You can use like I think it's 10 or 15 seconds of a clip of a song. You're legally allowed to do that from the Fair Use Act. But you can't play the whole song, right? You can't go through the whole thing. But on YouTube, you can't. You can't even get a bar in, right? I got popped for the reason why I had to redo the Dr. J segment music or intro. If you go back and listen to the original podcast, there's a clip from Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery. I didn't get popped for that. I got popped for the bell ringing from Hell's Bells. And so what I did, if you've noticed, I went in and I found a generic, copyright-free, common or open market or whatever, public. God, I cannot, I swear to God, guys, my brain is dying because I cannot, I cannot figure out words anymore. Public domain. Went into the public domain, found just this random generic bell, and I put that up, and then a song that I had recorded years ago, ironically titled Blind. And I did not do that on purpose, and in fact, it hit me afterwards, after the fact. And then, of course, I put Jupiter doing his intro over top of it, just so I wouldn't get popped by YouTube, because they will come after you. I got popped for a TED Talk. And last I checked, TED Talks are public domain. That's getting beside the point. So let me come back to what I was talking about. So Rick is always fussing about that, but you can see how they're panicking. And I think one of the early short files I did, I talked about the relationship between the record companies, between the record industry and the streaming services. And what we're seeing is the streaming services are slowly becoming more powerful than the record companies, which I'm going to show you here. I promise you. Now's when I'm going to show you the chart. But the record companies are losing power, and so they're scrambling and they're freaking out. And I think a lot of the things that Rick Beato is typically, and he's not the only one who complains about this. I've seen several different videos from people who are just complaining about the fact that when you're using this as a teaching tool, you should be able to do it without getting popped for copyright infringement. But they've got people and they've got algorithms to find it, and then they report it to YouTube, and YouTube doesn't ask any questions because YouTube realizes, and Beato talks about this. YouTube realizes the litigation alone is going to cost millions. And so it's easier just to kind of play along with these record companies and do what they say. Because again, they're freaking out. Their cash cow from the mid-'60s to the late 90s and early 2000s is dead. The album is dead. And we've seen, like, I keep hearing about this LP revival, or vinyl revival. That's what it is, the vinyl revival. I want to show you a little something here in a minute. This is not really much of a revival at all. But I keep hearing about that, and I'm like, no, that's basically just a fad right now. When we hear, you're going to have, the return of the album is going to happen when you have some amazing artist or group of artists who start making these long form art projects again, and the public falls in love with it immediately. Kind of like what we saw with Nirvana, what we saw with Pearl Jam, what we saw with the Beatles, what we saw with Guns N' Roses, what we saw with Bruce Springsteen, what we saw with John Cougar Mellencamp, what we saw with Elvis, where they just buy into it and they fall in love, and countless others. Madonna, Michael Jackson, all the major names. Bob Dylan. So, all right, so let's talk about numbers. All right, so this is going to be fun. All right, so this is the RIAA.com's website, okay? And the RIAA, like I said, tracks the sales of American American record sales. And for those of you who are listening to the podcast, I'm going to describe it to you so you don't have to worry about trying to pull this up. But you can go to RIAA.com US Sales Database. If you just Google that, you can see what I'm talking about. And it's a really cool interactive thing. They have several different boxes where you can manipulate the data to show certain things. And what I've got showing in the video here is the LP sales, the cassette sales, the CD sales. Whoa, what happened? Where'd it go? Oh, it reset. Now I got to reset it. Well, that's cool. You get to see a demonstration. So if you're listening to the podcast, I'm going to tell you what I'm doing. So the first thing I'm doing is selecting a date range, and I'm picking 1989 to 2019. And then they have a box where you can select what format you want, and it defaults to all. So you can clear that off, and I'm going to click on cassette, CD. Come on, CD. And it'll bring the CDs in. Download album. There, it brings it up. LP, EP. And I'm also going to pick on-demand streaming and paid subscription. And once you pick all those, so I've got cassette, CD, download album, LP, on-demand streaming, and paid subscription. Okay, and they've got other things like sound exchange distribution, synchronization, vinyl singles, other digital, ringtones and ringbacks, other ad-supported streaming, music videos, physical, music video download, single download, DVD audio, kiosk, limited tier, paid subscription, etc., etc. All right, but I'm just picking, like I said, the LP, the cassette, the CD, the download album, the paid subscription, the on-demand streaming. So as you can, for those of you who are watching the video, you can see between 1999 and 2000 is when the album peaked. Okay, in 1999, the total amount of albums sold was $13.9 billion. Okay, you have 0.2% of that was actual vinyls. 7.6% of that were cassettes, and then the other 92% were CDs. Okay, that was in 1999. That is the most albums ever sold in a single year. You go to 2000, and you have the most CDs sold, but the albums actually dropped from 13.9 billion to just under 13.9 billion. Just a little bit less, excuse me, than what they had before. But CDs, this is the year that the CDs sold the most, and CDs accounted for $13.2 billion worth of sales. And then you get to 2001, and you start to see the drop, and it's a small drop at first. $13.3 billion for all selective formats. 2002, 12.3 billion. 2003, 11.4, jumps up in 04 to 11.5, and then drops again to 10.8, and you start to see it just slide all the way down. And then you get to the lowest point, which was in 2014, excuse me. 2014, total number of album sales across all formats, $4.2 billion. Now remember, the peak in 1999 was $13.9 billion. The lowest point in the last 30 years, 30, right? 1, 2, 3, yeah, 30 years, was $4.2 billion. Now numbers go up, and in 2019, 8.3 billion came from revenue, long play revenue. But here's the problem. The majority of that, 71% of it, is streaming, paid subscription, and then another 10% of on-demand streaming with ad support. Okay, stuff like Pandora. Okay. And of course, paid subscription is the premium stuff. Downloaded albums, which is the digital albums, 4%, 4.7%. CDs made up 7.4%, and then the LPs made up 6%. You're like, ho, you're going to talk about the vinyl revival. $497 million was made from the LPs, okay, out of a total of $8.3 billion. $497 million out of the $8.3 billion. Again, that is or is it 6% of the total revenue. So it's not a lot. And especially when you look at, again, $13.9 billion in 1999, when the total sales, the total album sales had actually reached its highest, versus 8.3 billion for last year, which has been the highest in the past, since 2007 or since 2006. Okay. So last year was the highest since 2006. So you're starting to see revenue coming back into the music industry, but the problem is the revenue that's coming is the paid subscription. If we take the paid subscription out and the on-demand stuff, you'll see that the physical formats are suffering tremendously. $1.5 billion. If you take paid subscriptions out and you're just focusing on the physical, well, we've got the download albums in here too. But you can see, if you're watching the video, you can see just how dramatic that is. And then for those of you who are listening on the podcast, here's how I'm going to describe it. It's like a cliff. It just drops dramatically, and it's amazing to see how that works. So if you get a chance, go to the website or come to YouTube and check out at least this portion of the video, so you can see it. So what the point is that I'm trying to make is that we have the album. We've lost patience with the album, if that makes sense. We've lost patience with sitting down and listening to a long-form piece of art. And several different factors contribute to that. The peer-to-peer networks started it. iTunes coming along with their Rip, Mix, Burn campaign with the iPod. And all of a sudden you have the opportunity to create whatever you want out of your music, out of the songs that you have. The economics are much better, or much more, are much easier to navigate in a digital realm. It's much easier to afford a subscription service for $15 a month or $20 a month or $10 a month, whatever you've got, than it is to go out and spend. I think in 1994, I was reading an article in 1994, the average consumer was spending anywhere between $60 and $100 on physical CDs in a month. It's just, because CDs were like $15 a pop. And depending on which music store you went to, sometimes you could pay $20, But in the early to mid 90s, CDs were $15, $20, between $15 and $20. Most of the time, the average is about $15. But you go out and you buy 4 CDs, one a week. That adds up, right? Where now you pay $15 once a month, and you're done. And you've got full access to an entire library that seems to be infinite. And they're adding to it every day, right? And so we've lost patience for the album. patience for listening to one artist and their artistic expression. Norah Jones came out with a new album a couple weeks ago, and they were promoting it on Amazon Music, and I thought, I ought to listen to that, and it's been several weeks. And normally, used to, when Norah Jones would put out a new album, I'm like, oh, listen, I want to hear it. I want to hear it now. I still haven't listened to it. And like I said, I've got Amazon Music, so all I have to do is tell her, hey, Alexa, play Norah Jones' most recent album, and she'll do it, in order. Unlike the early days of Amazon Music, where it was not in order and it was all screwed up, but we won't go into that. About how the early days of digital music was pretty horrific, pretty aggravating. Not horrific, but just aggravating, because they were still working on the things. But anyway. And so that's what's happened. So that's what's happened to the album. I'm not going to be one who says it'll never come back. It will. We go through phases. But we just got to, what's got to happen is you've got to have an artist or a group of artists that are going to come along, like I said, and make the album appealing. And then once that happens, it'll happen. So there you go. So there's that for this week, or for this episode. Next episode, we're going to talk about the Unity project that the Weinstein brothers, Brett and Eric, are promoting. And it's pretty interesting. Tucker Carlson allowed Mr. Weinstein to come on his show and talk about it. Rogan, he talked about it on Joe Rogan. He talked about it on Rising with Sagar and Crystal. Actually, Crystal wasn't there. It was the dude from The Intercept, Ben something. But he's been on, Brett Weinstein has been going around. I think he and his wife have actually done a podcast on it too, of explaining what they're talking about with the Unity project. And it's very interesting. So we're going to talk about it. I'm not going to promote it. I'm not going to say whether or not it's good or bad, but I'm going to let you know what it is, because in this binary system, we need to know all the options if we're going to make an informed decision. So I'm going to talk about it. And for my 6 or 7 listeners or viewers, you'll get to learn what the Unity project is. So yay, I'll make a dent. It'll be a very small dent, right? But it'll be a dent. So anyway, all right. So that's it for this one. Check out our site, thebetafiles.com, our blog, where you can catch all this material, plus written material as well that kind of goes hand in hand with this. And like I said, you can check for the updated schedule that starts on the 13th of July that week. Okay? Make it a great day. I'll see you right back here. This has been the Beta Files.